Hi, welcome to the Agent Odyssey. My name is Matt Wyman. I am CEO and co-founder of Acario. Acario is a simulation platform, so you can see what your agents are going to do in the real world before you put them out and take on that risk. Today, I'm really excited to have with us Joe Luchs. He is the founder and CEO of Datalinx AI. And Datalinx is this amazing agentic system that thinks about data preparation, governance, and automation for commercial organizations. And instead of my describing it, Joe, I want to turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about the Datalinx journey and what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me on the podcast.
Absolutely.
Datalinx is kind of a culmination of a problem that my co-founders and I have been dealing with for, really the past kind of, 15, 20 years of our respective careers, which is just that people want to do interesting things with data. But they typically run into all sorts of data readiness issues, whether it is, organizing the data, normalizing the data, cleaning the data, whatever it may be. And now that we've got this incredible opportunity with AI and enterprises face a lot of pressure to just make the most of it, they typically find themselves, buying their AI Ferrari. Then they show up to the gas station and then they're told, hey, you got to drill into the ground, extract the fuel, refine the fuel, put it into the pump, then you can put it into your car. And then you can use your super cool AI Ferrari. I spent about 5 years at Amazon, and at a certain point, after you hear hundreds of different folks tell you we'd love to do this use case, but our data is a mess, the craziest thing to do would be to not solve that problem. So sure enough, founded Datalinx, and we are tackling that data readiness challenge head on.
Awesome. I'm as you're talking about data and getting fuel for the Ferrari, which I love that metaphor, by the way. Um, it also strikes a nerve with me with trust. And it seems like as people are building these agents and whatnot, they're really leaning heavily into all the different mechanisms so that they can feel as though they trust it. Guardrails and oversight and of course, as a simulation company, we see a lot of that. How do you see that relationship? And how do you see that perspective around trust in the enterprise with these complex agent systems?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one of the beauties of AI is that it's incredibly creative. We've all seen amazing things get generated through these AI tools, but one of the downsides is that it's incredibly creative. And in the enterprise world, you need determinism. You need, you can't just willy-nilly violate GDPR. You'll get fined 4% of your business's annual revenue. So there's areas in which you need just a maximum fidelity, you know, uh, roughly 100%, because if you were to violate some law, if you were to, show something, sensitive or problematic to an individual customer, you could find yourself in hot water. And so I think where a lot of the hesitations have come in and slowness for a lot of enterprises in adopting AI is just they don't know exactly what the AI is going to do. And they don't know exactly how to put guardrails in place to regulate that. We started with these RAG frameworks, which, in certain ways were effective, but certainly not a catch-all. We're now moving more towards MCPs as a way to try and govern, these AI and agentic systems. But I think it takes a combination of different resources to make sure that you put the trust and governance in place. And then you really have to see it. You have to actually have to test it and see it and see how, the AI system is going to behave with a certain prompt. And then coming out the other side, it's like, okay, got it. I've tested X, Y, and Z different vectors. I've put A, B, and C guardrails in place. I'm starting to feel more comfortable that my enterprise AI is going to abide by the rules I need it to.
I'm always struck that a certain number of those activities are pre-production, and they should be pre-production. The analysis and whatnot, but the concept of guardrails itself is in production, and always feels like it's too late. I mean, is guardrails the right way to think about this, or are there other angles that we should be thinking about uh, as we think about the larger category of trust, in which, by the way, when people say trust, it's like inclusive of everything. So, I, how, like, do you see that there's another angle, another way to approach this?
Mm. So I think you also kind of have to figure out your risk tolerance in certain areas. And I think every enterprise needs to understand what that looks like. Um, there's a world in which you have a chat bot that doesn't know the answer to a question that a customer asks. That's okay, as long as you have a place to route that customer to, right? Um, there's a world in which you use AI to generate creatives so you can have more personalized experiences for customers. Well, if your creative's like a little bit pixelated or, a person in it has like a sixth finger, at the end of the day, that's not that big of a deal. On the
If it's
flip
even
side,
noticed.
yeah, yeah, if they even see it. On the flip side, if you're a financial services institution and you violate fair lending practices, um, well, you could find yourself in a rather significant hole. There's an example somebody mentioned the other day where there's a, a fine amount for every time you deliver an advertisement that violates fair lending principles, and you know how exactly that gets tracked and flagged and fined and so forth. Like there's a lot of mechanisms behind that as well. But most financial services organizations that I work with, and one of our first customers is a financial services organization, they take this very seriously.
Of course they should.
And yes, and it's not even for many of them, it's not even a risk mitigation item as much as it's this is the right way to approach our customers and be thoughtful towards our customers, because they're heavily leaning into customer experience. Um, and so in that case, you do need 100%. And so that's where you don't really have a lot of latitude. You don't really have a lot of room for creativity. You almost have to make kind of a linear decision. um, so I almost view it as kind of, if you have this kind of flood of just incredible creativity coming through your suite of AI tools and agents, you inevitably have to have a dam set up. And then that dam can allow water to go through in fairly constricted fashions. And, there's always going to be like a stick or a rock or something that ends up going through the dam that you didn't necessarily account for. But you put this kind of, so maybe instead of guardrails, maybe it's you're kind of channeling all of this goodness into some very specific outputs that are
Yeah.
meaningful for your customers. And so that's maybe a better analogy, is how do you channel this flood of goodness into something that is very beneficial for your customer base?
It it feels like that also emphasizes the data that sits underneath. I mean, the AI systems aren't, they're just not useful unless they're actually connecting you to and surfacing relevant information. But that's a whole different dimension. I mean, that's no longer, to me, that's not creativity within the model. Now we're talking about something broader, that they're being built on and around. So how do you extend it into that space?
Yeah, it's a great question, and part of why we started Datalinx is because so much of being successful in this AI era, and frankly, even the ML era previously, was about getting your data into the right shape such that it could, fuel these applications effectively. We've all heard the stats, the MIT published study of 95% of enterprise AI pilots showing no P&L impact. There's a Gartner stat of 85% of enterprise data projects are failing due to data readiness issues. The data plane that lives underneath these enterprise applications is so critical, but it's really, really hard to get that into the right place. Part of
Mhm.
it is because these data sets might be siloed, they're coming from different sources. But part of it is also just the fact that they're high scale and high cardinality, right? Like if you really think about just something like Claude Code as an example, right? If you're trying to run tests on a code base, sure, that's 400,000 lines. But I'm working with a data provider right now that has 38 billion rows in their file. So how do you rationalize that into an easily usable data product? That's a hard thing to do. And so as we think about kind of, how do you actually get data into a usable state? What we're finding more and more is that not only is it the critical foundation, but it's almost a practice in its own right. it's very easy to say, great, we're going to use this AI for a marketing personalization solution. But every single one of those downstream applications and models is dependent on good data lines coming in. And unless you actually do the work and put the investment into getting that data foundation right, everything downstream is going to be pretty messy.
Yeah, that, by the way, 38 billion in a single, but that's just unbelievable. I mean, I've worked with enterprise organizations that do, but it's still, it's a huge number. It also calls to mind that the nuances in the data itself. So let's say you did have it beautifully organized and beautifully accessible to the model, but that still doesn't mean things like permissions and understanding authorization around that data is well understood. And I was in fintech for many years. A single row in the database might have a whole set of different elements, some of which are accessible to low permission folks and some of which are accessible to high permission folks. And you might be 5 or 6 different, access patterns to that single row. You're not going to go split it up. Well, I wouldn't expect you to go split it up into all the possible interactions of all the different permissions. That'd be N by M, be crazy. But if you want to have a useful agent and that agent's taking actions on behalf of, how do you maintain all of this? So the data, it's not just pristine data, it's also understanding the relationships within the data.
Hmm.
And then that feeds straight into trust as well. Because if your agent takes actions that it shouldn't have, then you don't trust the agent, even if it was perfectly functioning. Like it didn't do anything outside of the boundaries of what it was given. It took the action it was allowed to take. So how are you working with people to reimagine the data and the cleanliness and the availability of that data to ensure that as they're building agents, they can hold on to these types of concepts?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's kind of this evolving paradigm where there's kind of the historical principle of least privilege, only give
Hmm.
people access to what makes sense. But that's starting to change now, and in a big part of it is because as the tooling gets better and people don't have to write SQL as an example, right? There's so many additional people that just through natural language can actually ask questions of the data and get answers. And so this prevailing principle of least privilege is kind of falling by the wayside as you realize like, oh no, we could cut out a lot of the, slowness and a lot of these middle pieces to get where you need to go. The way that our system, and this is kind of an intentional design principle, was actually introducing ontologies into the system. And the way I describe ontologies, right, is all the different data pieces you might get are kind of like the components that make up a piece of IKEA furniture, and then the ontology is the guide on how you actually assemble that
Assemble
IKEA
it.
furniture. Yeah. Now, when we first started kind of building this concept of ontologies and getting very directed in terms of what the data needs to be structured like, we were really just trying to solve these commercial use cases, e-commerce, marketing, advertising, which is what we Datalinx focus on. And the real vision was how do we get somebody from a raw data set to a usable data product in 5 minutes? And so there's a lot of business value associated with that, but there's also a lot of risk associated with that, as you can imagine. And so what became very clear quickly, and we got help from, our first financial services customer in defining this is we actually, in addition to the ontology pointing towards a use case, it also introduced governance. And then the only reason that our agents are as good as they are and can give these high fidelity answers is because they have a very, very clear guidebook. Again, using that IKEA assembly analogy, they have a very, very clear guidebook on what functions they need to perform to actually get this data into a usable state. But then we also added the governance, which is what do you need to not do? What are the things that are off limits? What are the things that you shouldn't touch? And so ontologies, other folks use kind of concept of context graphs or context tracing. All of these concepts, I think, have proven to be um, an emerging paradigm for how you allow the AI agents to be directed and productive, not unlike how you would train or guide a human employee that you hire, while also actually putting the guardrails on them such that there's pretty clear kind of policy limits that keep the agents from going off the rails.
So then how do you deal with situations where in order to answer a question, you need constituent ingredients to potentially pull together into an equation or math or other, information necessary to provide the answer, but the answer itself is no longer traceable back to the original data set, and the person the agent's talking to has permission to know the answer but does not have permission necessarily to have the raw ingredients that were necessary to go generate it. How, like, the agent, a human sits in between and knows, oh, I can do this calculation and give someone information about the potential loan. I'm not going to tell them exactly all the infinite discount opportunities and the points on this mortgage, but I can give them the final product. Um, how do you deal with that in your ontologies? Like, is there a concept of access and what can be presented and what can be pulled together? How do you represent it?
Yeah, so part of it is classic kind of user access rights. So,
Hmm.
what does this particular user role have access to? And, there's kind of hierarchies of information. So there's the answer. Hey, like, how many sponges did we sell last month? Cool. You got 100,000 sales. It's like, great. Help me understand the breakdown of where, geographically where those sales happened. That person, if they have access, then great. We show them that underlying data. If they don't have access, then they get a message showing that they don't have access rights. So part of it is just, let's set up the access rights in the right way in the first place. Or I shouldn't say the right way. Let's set up the access rights in a smart way in the
In a
first
clear
place.
manner.
Yep. Then what we've actually built into the system, which has been really helpful, is um, logging and consolidation of blockers
Hmm.
into product feedback. So, as an example, you might have your analysts ask a question, try and get some information, and they get blocked by the agent. Okay, that automatically gets logged as, hey, the user got blocked here for these reasons. Here's what they were asking. Here's, like here's basically the chain of events, and then here's a specific reason why they didn't have access to that underlying data, and that goes directly to the product teams, IT teams, the governance teams, whoever is specifically managing the user access rights, and then they get to say, oh, okay, we actually should give this set of personas access there. So it's one thing to be able to Slack somebody and be like, hey, like admin, like I need rights here. But what if you're a really big organization? What if you don't even know who that person is?
Yeah.
Um, we built it such that we can consolidate that information, and then the people managing access rights can see where the blockers were and then make decisions based on that.
Interesting. And so broaden that for me, because if I'm thinking about my data, that is a deep and specific example of the type of concerns that appear. I have to imagine there are many more across the different spectrum. So, maybe high level, like, what are some of those examples? And I'm just going to double up on that, which is, as you're going and talking to a new enterprise, a new opportunity, how do you describe it to them? Like, are they telling you we have a problem? Are you introducing to them this opportunity? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and we're very, very much responding to the problems that our customers are coming to us with. It's everything from data quality to data normalization to data enrichment to vector embedding. Some of the problems are fairly simple. Some of the problems are more complex or laborious. What's very consistent, though, is that mapping and context sharing across the business side and the technical side is missing. And what it
Yeah.
leads and it leads to a big problem where there's just constant breakages between the data that gets presented to the business team and then them actually getting good output. Where that's landed us is we have a lot of conversations with customers, prospects. And what they tell us is, here's a specific thing that's breaking. Here's a specific use case that's problematic. Those are the business stakeholders. Then the tech stakeholders say, this is what's soaking up a ton of our time. This is what's making our life a living hell. Um, and so the business users are thinking about, how do we get a high fidelity data product faster? The tech users are thinking about, how do I save time and energy? So 80% of my time isn't spent on kind of data janitor work. Like, I want to go build models and applications and like the cool stuff. Um, and so
More transformation pipelines.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. I don't want to be tweaking DBT models. That's not
Right.
what anybody wants to spend their day doing. And so what we found is that the problems are consistent. They're frequently described in different ways, but they're very, very consistent. And what it frequently just comes back to is, well, how do you create a level of determinism between the source data and then the actual use case that you're trying to get to? Um, and that's where this kind of, set of mapping exercises comes into play. For somebody who's trying to do loyalty marketing over email, as an example, how do you consolidate all of the data of existing customers and then any additional attributes that you need to append to those profiles, such that you can do micro segmentation, hyper personalization, and in addition to that, actually like generate the right copy for that email, generate the right image for that email, whatever it may be. So all of those are different things that get fed through by having a deterministic data system that can actually, again, take you from messy source all the way to the use case. And then, of course, you have user access rights along the way there, such that certain people can access certain information. But again, in a lot of cases, if things aren't breaking, people don't need to necessarily dig deeper and ask a bunch of questions.
Yeah, interesting. I'm finding as I'm engaging that there's a new attitude towards data access and expectations. And I'm wondering if you're seeing something similar. Um, from day one, we built our solution to run air gapped fully on-prem or in the cloud, because we sort of saw that to make these agents useful, you need access to data. A lot of the data is going to be protected. It's not going to be just obviously it's not going to be freely available, but it's not even going to be generally available. It's going to be very much locked up. And I'm curious how you're thinking about and what you're seeing. I have to imagine you're bumping into a lot of the same, cloud versus something a little bit more controlled. And I feel like it filters right straight through what you just talked about in terms of access and being able to connect the data together and allow people to actually generate insights from it. How do you see that changing and where we're housing it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the great consolidation is happening. I'm definitely seeing more and more organizations kind of pick one environment in which they seek to consolidate their data. For a variety of reasons. It makes life a lot easier, right? Like, if you put everything into Databricks, if you put everything into Snowflake, everything into AWS, great. You have a singular data plane that you can, work off of. And, in the case of using something like GCP, you could theoretically have, Gemini pretty easily natively integrated into that. Uh, so I see a lot of enterprises trying to consolidate the data. What they are frequently running into, though, is that, as an example, in the advertising world, right, you might get all of your advertising logs delivered to an S3 bucket, but you might do a lot of your consumer analytics in Databricks, right? And so then you might find yourself with a series of, disparate data storage mechanisms, different kind of access rights. So going back to access rights, one of the most common paradigms I see is aggregated data is much more freely available. Um, personal data may have a lot more guardrails around it, and organizations trying to obfuscate certain vectors. Um, but as much as a lot of these organizations are trying to consolidate data into a single environment, it's a really, really complicated practice. part of why we built our system to be able to work on the cloud as well as on-prem, as well as be able to actually analyze tables stored in multiple different environments, is because, we've gone and talked to, companies, just like as an example, one who told us that, yeah, we've got a range of different assets stored in GCP, a range in Azure, and then we have done some consolidation into Databricks. Well, if all of those data assets are critical for figuring out how to do kind of a effective marketing and advertising strategy, well, you do need to be able to tap into all of those pools and actually normalize those against a central ontology. And so that's part of kind of why we designed our architecture in a way where we could operate across multiple different environments. And then in the future, we hope to see a world in which, more and more organizations kind of, drop data into a single place. It's still not going to be easy to get that data into a usable state once it's in that single place, but at least it does simplify the access components.
Do you think that that's going to lead a trend towards bare metal?
Uh, Oh, that's the other big element here, which is cost, right? And so, metal is pretty good for cost management. You got to outlay uh some cash up front, but yeah, comparatively, boy, it can be a lot less expensive than the cloud. Um, One thing that I think is going to be really interesting is when AI stops getting subsidized and
Yeah.
people start paying the full price. I think that's going to have these kind of, waves of infrastructure impacts hit it. And I do have a lot of kind of questions about how that's going to manifest. Because the thing is like, you can have fragmentation in your um, CPU, as an example, and still have a really functional technical architecture. But that fragmentation in CPU or GPU often leads to fragmentation in where the data is. And that could be a real kind of trade-off for any enterprise as they try and figure out how do we manage costs versus how do we actually have a clean data plane. And that is part of the reason why we architected, our solution the way we did is we just don't necessarily know, but we know what customers are asking us today, and they do want us to have an understanding of multiple different data environments.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, it's the classic pendulum swinging, right? And when inevitably when you see something swing in a particular direction really hard, like towards the cloud, towards entirely, externally managed infrastructure, you do typically see it come back at some point. And having lived on both sides of it, the bare metal is amazingly cost effective until you hit plus 5 years, and now you have to redo the whole thing and figure out how you're going to go through and upgrade, and like it starts to, it's plus years, you start to see that cost. But I think it's a different world than it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And these resources are available differently, and it's a great point with the taking the full cost of models. And there are a lot of subsidies floating everywhere. And there are a lot of hidden subsidies as well, because it comes all the way down to energy and location. So,
Mhm.
I think that's going to be fascinating. And particularly if you're dealing with large quantities of data and you're going to end up with a large number of agents, I would assume, interacting with those data sets. So it's going to be a multiplied problem. So
Mhm.
as I'm thinking about all that, I mean, there's this constant learning. I just wonder, as you think about the future world, not just inside of our bubble of building companies, but in just the broader world, what are the skills that you think people need to really embrace so they can actually be more ready for AI and agents and this next generation of ML?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first one that always stands out to me is, um, and this is part of another reason why I wanted to leave Amazon and start my own company, is that I found myself with a decent understanding of AI and agents and RAG and MCP while I was at Amazon, and I could talk about it reasonably well. You'll never be as good at this stuff until you actually do it yourself. Anybody that wants to really understand AI and frankly future proof their career, I'd encourage them to just build something. Whether you're a foodie like me and you build an agent to make restaurant reservations for yourself, whether you're just trying to automate your email follow-ups with, some kind of, templatized mechanism that can just take a transcript and turn that into, a really clean follow-up email. Um, there's all sorts of little things that somebody can do, and you don't have to know how to code. Honestly, you don't have to really know that much about tech at all. A lot of these tools are getting really, really good at being able to actually just write you something, either as just like a very, small kind of function on top of an application, or creating a new application, and it'll just literally write the code for you. And so all this is to say, do it, get hands on. That's the number one thing I'd encourage anyone to do. And then I think the second thing I'd mention is just get really, really good at context engineering your usage of AI. Um, so what we found, and part of the reason why Databricks invested in us is we found that trying to do the types of tasks that we were doing, data preparation specifically for marketing, advertising, and other purposes, if you just used kind of a traditional tool set, you can get part of the way there. But it was hard to kind of get to that last mile of what's the right audience going to be, and segmentation within that audience and personalization within that audience to run a loyalty campaign in Salesforce, just as an example. Um, Once you actually context engineer these agents appropriately, so they know what data to look for, they know how to structure that data such that it can, easily match into, Salesforce Marketing Cloud or Klaviyo or Braze or, any of these other really fantastic tools out there. Um, if you actually context engineer the agents, much like how you would train a human employee, they'll do really good work for you. And so even just, getting really good at telling ChatGPT, hey, like I want you to structure the response this way. I want you to look at these specific types of information sources. I want you to take into account these three documents. What you'll start to see is you get just much, much higher quality AI outputs. And so the context engineering component is, I think, often overlooked. And I think that's a huge, huge area where folks can really improve the value they get out of AI, and have a much faster learning curve.
No, I love that. And I love the fearlessness. Like you're really saying, hey, just go play, try, learn, and push forward into this new world. And I also think it's fascinating that context engineering, there are these moments, these amazing magical moments in the world where new things get invented and sometimes new jobs get invented. And I think that literally context engineering is it's going to be a title, it's going to be a role in the future. And it didn't exist 2 years ago. So I think that's the other. I love that you called that out because it's the opportunities are all over the place. And it's not as though there's a university degree in context engineering. It's something you, at this point, people are going to go figure out and learn. Maybe in the future there's a degree, but right now it's a matter, exactly as you said, experimentation and learning. So I love that.
100%. And then the last thing I'll say is just put it out there. My old boss from AWS, who's now over at Databricks, created this really amazing application where it's just a better experience for learning guitar. He's a
Mm,
guitar
cool.
he's a guitar player, and he came up with this kind of great little mechanism where it can actually track your strokes as you're playing and learning, and it can give you kind of like real-time support in just like a really interesting way. And so there's little things like that that you can just publish and put online, and it just shows that you have kind of an aptitude around these types of topics. It's a good way to demonstrate. Not only is it a good way to learn, but it's a good way to demonstrate that I played with AI. I have a good
Yeah, I've
understanding of
done
what
something.
what some of these capabilities are. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I love it. It also brings together other parts of our lives. We don't all have to just be in the workplace. We can actually bring other things we're doing together. Love it.
Yeah, I mean, we're all gonna be increasingly robotic, so
Yes.
it's nice to humanize ourselves a little bit.
Absolutely. Joe, thank you for a wonderful conversation today. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you as well. I appreciate it.